Millionaire finds a little girl begging for food outside an upscale restaurant. He decides to follow her and is shocked by what he sees. James built his fortune from nothing, starting without any support or security. An orphan since his teenage years, he grew up without a home to return to, without parents to guide him or siblings to share the weight of life. From an early age, he learned that he was alone in the world, and that if he wanted something, he would have to earn it on his own. His sharp intelligence and unwavering determination led him to the top, making him one of the country's most successful entrepreneurs. Today, his name was synonymous with power and wealth, and luxury surrounded him from all sides. Sophisticated cars, exclusive parties, trips to any place in the world. There was no limit to what he could have. But despite all his grandeur, James never shut himself off in his position. He was a man with an easy smile, accessible even to those whom many would ignore. Generous by nature, he helped without expecting anything in return. He treated employees with respect, offered opportunities to those in need, and never turned his face away from others' pain. Even surrounded by power and influence, he kept an open heart, believing that his true wealth lay in the way he impacted others' lives. That night, after an exhausting day dealing with endless meetings and decisions that moved fortunes, James felt the weight of fatigue pressing on his shoulders. His company continued to grow, new contracts were closed, investments were multiplying his wealth, but none of this seemed to ease the accumulated tension. The luxury and success that so many envied didn't offer rest for a mind that was always alert, always planning the next move. He decided he needed a moment to himself. No commitments, no obligations, just a peaceful meal to end the day. He chose the most refined restaurant in the city, a place he'd frequented for years, and where he knew he would find impeccable service and the serene atmosphere he needed. As soon as he stepped out of the car, the night's cold enveloped him, bringing a momentary relief to the exhaustion he felt. He walked toward the restaurant's entrance, but before crossing the door, something made him stop. His eyes caught a scene that for most people would have been just an annoying detail to ignore. There, standing right in front of the elegant glass of the restaurant, was a small girl. Skinny, dirty, her clothes were too thin for the night's cold. She stared intently at the refined dishes being served inside, but beyond that, she stretched out her hand to every person who passed by, murmuring a timid request for help, asking if anyone could buy her something to eat. However, everyone who passed by turned their gaze away, ignoring her as though she didn't exist, some throwing contemptuous glances before continuing on their way, indifferent to the hunger and desperation shining in her eyes. James felt something tighten in his chest. How many times had he seen situations like this? How many times had he witnessed the contrast between luxury and misery? But for some reason, this scene struck him differently. There was something in the girl's expression, the way her eyes clung to the steaming plates, that stopped him from simply walking in and continuing his night as though nothing had happened. Without a second thought, he called over a waiter who was hurrying by the entrance. "Take that girl inside. Tell her I want her to sit down and order the best dish on the menu." His voice was firm, leaving no room for questions. The waiter hesitated for a moment, as though unsure whether to approach the child, but seeing the seriousness in James's gaze, he simply nodded and walked to the door. The girl stepped back a little when she saw the man in the suit approaching, her eyes full of alertness. But when he spoke softly, explaining that someone had invited her to eat, her expression changed, suspicion mixed with hope. She gave one last glance at the restaurant, then at the waiter, and finally at her own reflection in the glass, as if she couldn't believe it was real, as though she was waiting to wake up from a dream. After a few seconds of hesitation, she agreed to follow the man inside. James watched her cross the door, noticing how out of place she seemed in the environment. The polished floor reflected the yellowish light from the chandeliers, and the tables were elegantly arranged, each detail meticulously planned to provide an impeccable experience for the customers. And there, in the middle of that world of sophistication, was a street girl, hesitant, her dirty feet leaving almost imperceptible marks on the shining floor. She was led to a table in the corner, away from the curious gazes of the customers, who, for a brief moment, paused their conversations to observe the unusual scene. James watched everything from afar, not wanting to intimidate her with his immediate presence. He ordered his own meal and, after a few minutes, walked over to the table where the girl was sitting. She didn't look directly at him. Her eyes were fixed on the white tablecloth, her hands resting in her lap, as though she were afraid to touch anything around her. The plate was placed in front of her, and it was at that moment that her gaze transformed. Her pale face gained a brief glow, but instead of devouring the food immediately, as James had expected, she did something that intrigued him. With discreet movements, she took small pieces of the meal and hid them in a plastic bag she had with her. The way she did it, trying not to draw attention, suggested that this wasn't the first time she had acted this way. She wasn't just hungry, she was saving it for someone. James stayed silent for a moment, observing her. Then he pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Is the food good?" he asked with a calm tone, not wanting to scare her. The girl jumped a little when she heard his voice, as though she had forgotten he was there. She lifted her eyes for a second, then lowered them again, giving a slight nod. He realized he would need to be patient. "I'm glad. I chose this dish because they always say it's one of the best here." His voice was light, as though they were just casually chatting, with no hurry, no pressure. She continued eating slowly, taking small bites, chewing carefully, as though she feared the food might disappear at any moment. James decided to try another approach. "Do you live nearby?" he asked, leaning slightly forward. This time, she didn't answer right away. She just lowered her head a little more and shrugged her shoulders. "That's okay. You don't have to talk if you don't want to." He smiled slightly. "I just wanted to know a little more about you." Silence. He realized he was moving too quickly. He waited a few more minutes, letting her feel comfortable finishing her meal. Finally, with a quiet voice, almost inaudible, she murmured, "Stephanie." James blinked, surprised to finally get an answer. "Stephanie, is that your name?" He smiled, trying to show that this was important. She nodded, still not looking at him directly. "That's a pretty name." He paused. "You know, my name is James." The girl didn't say anything, just kept eating slowly, but something in the way her shoulders relaxed indicated she was starting to feel a little more comfortable. James observed every detail. The way she kept the bag close to her, protected like a treasure, the care she took with each bite, the silence heavy with something he still couldn't quite decipher. At the end of the meal, he felt he had to say something. He needed to offer more than just that one night of hot food. "Stephanie," he chose his words carefully, "I want to help you. I want to make sure you never have to ask for food again." He hoped she would feel relieved, that she would smile, that she would feel hope. But what he saw was the opposite. Her eyes widened in pure terror, her body tensed, her fingers gripping the edge of the bag as if preparing to hold something precious. "Hey, it's okay." James tried to reassure her, but before he could say anything more, the girl jumped up suddenly and ran. For a moment, James stood frozen. He hadn't expected that reaction. Something inside him turned, as though a silent alarm had been triggered. Without thinking twice, he stood up and ran after her. James left the restaurant without hesitation. The night's cold enveloped him again, but this time it didn't bring relief. In his chest, there was a strange weight, a tightness he couldn't ignore. His eyes followed the small figure of Stephanie, who was running down the sidewalk, dodging the few people still walking by. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate. She moved with the urgency of someone who already knew she couldn't waste any time. He decided to follow her. He kept a safe distance, making sure his steps didn't draw attention. Stephanie ran for a few blocks, then slowed down, looking around cautiously before turning the corner and disappearing into a less lit street. James quickened his pace, keeping an eye on her movements. The neighborhood changed as they went further. The glow of the store windows and upscale restaurants was replaced by narrow streets, dirty alleys, and cramped lanes. The contrast was glaring. There, luxury disappeared entirely, replaced by rundown buildings, spray-painted facades, and flickering streetlights. Stephanie walked with familiarity through that maze of dark streets. James realized it wasn't the first time she had taken that route. Her bare feet slid across the dirty ground without hesitation, as if she knew every hole, every corner, every shadow around her. He continued following her, now more cautiously, realizing that with each step, he was moving deeper into a world that few knew. After crossing a narrow alley, Stephanie stopped in front of a shabby building. James hid behind a nearby wall and watched. The house, if it could be called that, was a pile of cracked walls, holes in the roof and broken windows. The door barely hung on its hinges. The place looked abandoned, a forgotten piece of the city that no one noticed. Stephanie looked around to make sure no one was following her, and then entered. James felt his heart race. Something inside him told him he couldn't just walk away. He took a deep breath and approached, slipping through the open door quietly. The smell of mold and dirt hit him immediately, dense and damp, as though the air in there had been trapped for a long time. But nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. In the corner of the small room, on a piece of dirty cloth, was a boy even smaller than Stephanie. He looked to be no more than 8 years old. His body was too thin, his skin pale, and his eyes hollow, devoid of light. He lay on his side, too weak to even lift his head. His breathing was shallow, his lips cracked. Stephanie knelt beside him carefully, taking out the food she had hidden in the bag and starting to feed him small pieces. Her face showed no surprise or desperation. She was already used to this routine. She held each piece of food with delicacy, bringing it to the boy's mouth, patiently waiting as he chewed slowly. James felt a knot in his throat. Never, in all his years of life, had he felt something as overwhelming as what he was seeing now. This wasn't just poverty, it was desperation, abandonment, a misery so deep that everything around it seemed small and insignificant. His chest ached, a pain that wasn't physical but something deeper, something that felt like it was tearing a piece of his own soul away. He had always known inequality existed, that people were starving, but seeing it up close, smelling the place, seeing the boy's empty eyes, and the careful way Stephanie broke the food into pieces, as though performing an act of survival, made everything inside him churn. What did his money mean in the face of this? Luxury cars, expensive dinners, trips anywhere in the world. It all seemed so empty now. He was a powerful man, influential, had the resources to change lives, and yet there were children like them, forgotten by the world, fighting alone to survive. A bitter feeling rose in his throat, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he had failed as a person. The weight of his own fortune crushed him. He couldn't just keep looking. He moved without realizing it, and the sound of his foot hitting the floor echoed in the small space, making Stephanie jump. Her body stiffened instantly. She turned quickly, her eyes wide and frightened, and almost automatically she positioned herself in front of her brother like a fragile yet determined shield. Her arms wrapped around her own body as though she wanted to make herself small, invisible. Her chest rose and fell with quick breaths, but she didn't say anything. She just looked at him, waiting. James raised his hands slowly, realizing the fear in her eyes. "Hey, calm down." His voice came out low, careful. "I don't want to scare you." Stephanie didn't answer. Her eyes alternated between him and the door, as though she were evaluating the best way to escape. "What are you doing here?" Her voice came out in a weak whisper, hesitant. James breathed deeply. "I saw you running out of the restaurant and I got worried." She hugged her arms around her body and looked away. "Did you follow me?" "Yes." She lowered her head slightly and bit her lower lip. "Why?" James hesitated before answering. "Because I saw you save food instead of eating it all. I noticed you weren't just getting food for yourself." He looked at the still boy on the floor. "Now I know who it was for." Stephanie remained silent. Her nervous fingers played with the hem of her dirty shirt. James took a step closer, but slowly. "Who is he?" She swallowed hard and, in a quiet voice, answered, "My brother." "And what's his name?" She hesitated, as if giving that information was too much. But after a few seconds, she murmured, "Andrew." The name came out small but heavy with meaning. James nodded. "He's sick, isn't he?" Stephanie moved her head, agreeing. "Has anyone taken him to the doctor?" She shook her head slowly. "We can't." James felt a tightening in his chest. The boy was too pale, too thin. "Stephanie." He spoke carefully. "You can't keep living like this." She pressed her lips together, lowering her gaze. "He needs a doctor, and you need a safe place." Her eyes glimmered with a mix of fear and resistance. "I can't let anyone take him." "I don't want to separate you two," James said firmly. "I promise." Her eyes narrowed. "Everyone says that." James took a deep breath. "I'm not everyone." The silence between them was heavy. "Why did you run from the restaurant, Stephanie?" The question made her lift her eyes quickly. Her body shrank a little, and she took her time answering. "Because I thought you'd want to take us." James frowned. "Take you?" She shook her head slowly. "Just me." James felt a tightness in his chest. "Has someone tried to do that?" She nodded. "After Mom died." James stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "Some men came here. They said they were going to help, but they didn't want Andrew." She pressed her lips, moving her fingers nervously. "They said he was too sick, that it would be hard to find a place for him. But that maybe I—" She stopped, looking away, as though she didn't want to finish the sentence. James felt a lump in his throat. "And what did you do?" Stephanie hugged her body. "I ran." The answer was short, but full of meaning. James breathed deeply. "And since then, you've been taking care of him alone?" She nodded. "I try." James knelt slightly to be at her level. "Can you tell me how you ended up here?" Stephanie stayed silent for a while. She breathed deeply, as if organizing the words in her head, then began. "We always lived in a small place. It was just me, Andrew, and Mom. She worked cleaning houses. Sometimes she'd be out all day, but she always came back to be with us." She paused briefly. "One day, she started coughing a lot. I asked her if she was okay, and she said yes. But it kept getting worse. She'd cough, get tired, sometimes couldn't even get out of bed properly. But she still worked because she said she couldn't lose her job." James felt a knot in his throat, but stayed silent, letting her continue. "One day, when she was coming home, she collapsed in the street. Some neighbors helped, took her to the hospital, but she never came back." Stephanie stopped again, breathing deeply, trying to keep her voice steady. "After that, the man from the house we were living in said we couldn't stay there. He said, without money, it wouldn't work. He didn't care. He just told us to leave." She looked up at James, and he felt the weight of all that pain. "We didn't have anywhere to go." Her voice wavered a bit. "We kept walking. I tried asking for help, tried talking to people, but no one did anything. They just said they couldn't help or told us to leave." She took a long pause, as though she were fighting the memories. "Then I found this place. It was old, dirty, but it had a roof, and it was hidden. So we stayed here." James rubbed his face, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. "And how do you get food?" Stephanie shrugged her shoulders. "I ask, but people don't like it when we ask." "And where do you sleep?" "Here." James closed his eyes for a moment. He couldn't imagine what it was like for a child to live like that. "Stephanie," he chose his words carefully, "you don't have to live like this anymore." Stephanie lowered her eyes, biting her lip. I want to help him," she whispered, looking at Andrew, "but I don't know what to do." James nodded slowly. "What if I told you I know?" She looked at him with suspicion. "Why do you care?" James breathed deeply. "Because I can." He paused. "And because no one should ever go through what you're going through." The silence stretched between them. Stephanie looked at him as though she were trying to find something that proved he was lying. "And what if you change your mind later?" she asked softly. James smiled slightly. "I won't change." She hesitated. She looked at Andrew again, her small fingers smoothing his dirty hair. "He's so weak." James breathed deeply. "I know a doctor. We can take him now." Stephanie blinked a few times, as though trying to decide if this was real. "And I can stay with him?" "Yes." She bit her lip again, and James noticed her hands trembling slightly. "If you lie," she swallowed hard, "I'll run." James nodded. "If I lie, you can run." Silence once again filled the space. Finally, Stephanie breathed deeply and nodded. "Okay." James felt a weight lift from his chest. "We're getting him out of here." He approached slowly, trying not to scare her. Stephanie tensed when he knelt beside Andrew, but didn't say anything. James looked at the boy and felt his heart tighten as he saw how light he was when he lifted him into his arms. He seemed weightless. Stephanie walked beside him, constantly watching Andrew, as though she wanted to make sure he was still there. "Are you sure they won't separate us?" she asked softly. "Absolutely," James reassured her. She nodded, but still seemed alert. When they reached the car, James carefully opened the door and settled Andrew in the back seat. Stephanie got in beside him and held her brother's hand tightly. James got in the car and started the engine. "We'll take him to the doctor now. Everything will be fine." Stephanie didn't answer, but nodded slowly, without letting go of Andrew's hand. James knew there was still a long road ahead, but at that moment one thing was certain. He wouldn't leave these children alone ever again. James drove quickly, but carefully. The silence in the car was tense. Stephanie gripped Andrew's hand tightly, watching him with a fixed, worried gaze. The boy was so weak he hardly moved, his breathing slow and almost inaudible. James had never felt such urgency in his life. He had business, investments, decisions that moved millions, but nothing seemed as important as getting to the hospital on time. Stephanie looked at him a few times from the corner of her eye, still suspicious, still scared, but above all, exhausted. The girl didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. It was as if she was waiting for James to say he'd changed his mind, or that she would have to leave Andrew behind. "We're almost there," he said, trying to sound reassuring. Stephanie didn't respond, just nodded lightly, as though afraid to believe it. When they reached the hospital, James quickly got out of the car, picking Andrew up again. He felt the boy's absurd lightness and swallowed hard. How could he be so small, so fragile? Stephanie walked beside him, her fists clenched. Her eyes scanned everything around as if waiting for someone to show up and drag them away. When they entered the hospital, a nurse immediately approached, noticing Andrew's condition. "What happened?" she asked, assessing the child with concern. "He's weak. malnourished. We need help now." James's voice was firm, but there was a hidden desperation. The nurse quickly called for a team, who took Andrew from James's hands and hurried him inside. Stephanie's eyes widened, and she took a step forward. "Where are they taking him?" Her voice trembled with fear. "They're going to take care of him, Stephanie," James said calmly. "He needs this. But I want to stay with him." James knelt down in front of her, holding her shoulders gently. "You will. I promise. No one will separate you." She bit her lip, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "They always say that," she murmured. James looked at her firmly. "I'm not like them." Stephanie took a deep breath, her shoulders still tense, but she didn't argue further. She stayed by James's side as they waited. The following hours were the longest James had ever lived. They waited in a room while doctors and nurses took care of Andrew. Stephanie didn't say anything. She just looked at the closed door, her fingers repeatedly pressing the hem of her dirty shirt. Finally, a doctor came out holding a clipboard. "He's stable," he said, looking at James, "but he needs to stay in the hospital for a while. He's very malnourished and weak. If you had come any later—" He paused, not finishing the sentence. James nodded. "What needs to be done?" "We'll treat him. But besides that, this child needs a safe home, regular food, and constant medical care." James looked at Stephanie, who was watching him, waiting for him to speak. "He'll have all of that," James replied. "Don't worry." The doctor nodded and left. Stephanie took a deep breath and looked at James with an expression he couldn't completely decipher. "So, you're not leaving?" she asked. James shook his head. "No, I said I wouldn't leave you, and I won't." She furrowed her brow as if she still didn't know whether to believe him. "And after?" "After?" James smiled. "After, we'll find a place for you to live. A real place." Stephanie didn't say anything, just turned her gaze away. In the following days, James stayed with them. He made sure that Andrew received all the necessary treatment at the hospital, ensuring that nothing would threaten his health anymore. Meanwhile, he took care of Stephanie, making sure she had clean clothes, food, and a safe place to rest while they waited for her brother's recovery. Stephanie, however, remained suspicious. Even with all the help James was offering, she always seemed to be waiting for something bad to happen, for him to change his mind and disappear. She spoke little, responded with nods or short phrases, and always kept an alert gaze, as though she were preparing to run at any moment. "Do you think he'll really get better?" Stephanie asked one night as she sat in the chair beside Andrew's bed. James looked at the boy, who was already eating better and seemed a little stronger. "Yes, he will." She lowered her eyes, fiddling with the hem of her shirt. "And after you'll have a place to live, for real." She furrowed her brow, confused. "What do you mean?" James sighed and sat next to her. "I found a family willing to take you in." Stephanie's eyes widened, and she shrank back in the seat. "No." James was surprised by the reaction. "Stephanie, calm down. They're good people." She shook her head quickly. "I don't want to. I won't go anywhere without Andrew." "I know. You'll go together." She still had a tense expression. "And if they don't like us, what if they kick us out later?" James saw the genuine fear in her eyes. She wasn't just worried about the unknown, she was worried about being discarded again. "That won't happen," he assured her. "I chose these people because I know they'll take care of you." Stephanie looked at him in silence, as if trying to decide whether she could believe him. "And you?" she whispered. "Oh, will you disappear after?" James blinked, surprised by the question. "No." His voice was firm. "I'll always be around." She turned her gaze away, thoughtful. A few weeks later, Andrew was discharged from the hospital. Stephanie held his hand tightly as James took them to the new family's house. He could feel the tension in her body, but he knew that in time things would get easier. The house was cozy, with a large backyard and a gentle-looking couple waiting at the door. They smiled, but without exaggeration, without forcing any friendliness. They just waited patiently. Stephanie looked at James, hesitant. "If we don't like them, can we leave?" James knelt in front of her and held her small hands. "You'll never be trapped somewhere you don't want to be, but promise me you'll try." She looked at Andrew, who seemed excited by the idea of having a real room and food whenever he wanted. After a long silence, she nodded. "Okay." James smiled and ran his hand through her hair. "And remember what I said?" She looked up at him. "I'll always be around." And without realizing it, that night, the man who had always had everything found something he never knew was missing. A purpose. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.